There are sequels that exist to make money, and then there are sequels that exist to make a point. Magnum Force, released in 1973, belongs firmly in the second category, and understanding why transforms how you watch every single scene. This wasn't a film born from studio hunger for a quick cash grab on the back of Dirty Harry's box office success. It was born from backlash, controversy, and a genuine fear that one of cinema's most iconic characters had become a symbol of something dangerous. What the filmmakers built in response turned out to be one of the most deliberately crafted, ideologically loaded, and persistently misunderstood crime films of the entire decade. The secrets buried inside it have waited 50 years for the attention they deserve. To understand what Magnum Force was really doing, you have to go back to what Dirty Harry unleashed. The original film had ignited a fierce cultural debate that refused to die down quietly. Critics, commentators, and intellectuals had leveled serious accusations at the franchise, arguing that Harry Callahan represented a troubling authoritarian fantasy, a vigilante dressed up as a hero, a character whose methods implicitly endorsed the idea that the justice system was broken beyond repair and that real men with guns were the only solution. These weren't fringe complaints. They came from respected voices and respected publications, and they stuck. The studio and filmmakers recognized they had a problem that silence wouldn't solve. So rather than retreating or simply ignoring the noise, they chose to do something remarkable. They built an entire sequel around answering it. Every narrative decision, every thematic choice, every moral beat in Magnum Force was designed with those criticisms in mind. This was damage control through deliberate storytelling, and the fact that most audiences never recognize it as such speaks to just how skillfully it was executed beneath the surface of a perfectly functional thriller. What makes this even more fascinating is the quiet power shift that was happening behind the camera during production. Clint Eastwood was not content to simply show up, deliver his lines, and let other people steer the ship. He had lived inside Harry Callahan longer than anyone, understood the character with an intimacy that no director or screenwriter could match, and he was not about to let the sequel drift somewhere he didn't believe in. His influence expanded steadily throughout production in ways that went far beyond what audiences could see on screen. He shaped tone, guided character development, pushed back against decisions he disagreed with, and established the narrative boundaries that everyone else had to work within. This was a turning point not just for franchise, but for Eastwood's entire career. The franchise was quietly transforming from a studio property that happened to feature Eastwood into an Eastwood vision that the studio happened to be financing. He was using this sequel as a testing ground for creative authority he would go on to wield throughout one of Hollywood's most legendary directorial careers, and the film bears his fingerprints in ways that reward careful attention. One of the most startling things about Magnum Force, once you know to look for it, is the transparency with which it acknowledges its own dark inspirations. The concept of disciplined officers executing criminals outside the courts didn't come from American headlines or domestic political scandals. It came from something far more disturbing: the Brazilian death squads that operated with brutal efficiency in the early 1970s. Real institutional violence. Real patterns of sanctioned murder dressed up in the uniform of law enforcement. What makes this so unusual for a Hollywood production of this era is that the film doesn't hide this influence or obscure it through fictional distance. Characters in the script directly reference these foreign vigilante operations. The source material is embedded openly in the dialogue for anyone paying close enough attention to notice. Hollywood typically buries its controversial inspirations under layers of fictionalization, but here the filmmakers made the opposite choice. By grounding their story in real-world horror from another continent, they gave a narrative an unsettling authenticity that purely imagined threats could never have achieved. The villains aren't invented dangers. They're based on actual patterns of what institutional power looks like when it decides the courts are an inconvenience rather than a foundation. The core challenge the filmmakers faced was a reputation problem of significant proportions. Harry Callahan had lodged himself in the public imagination as the face of vigilante justice, and whether that reading was fair to the original film or not, it had become the dominant cultural narrative surrounding the character. Critics and commentators were citing him as a symbol of dangerous authoritarian fantasy, and that association was not fading on its own. The creative team behind the sequel made the decision to address this directly by recalibrating everything about how Harry operates and what he represents within the story. His actions were reconfigured. His choices were redesigned. His moral compass was deliberately reoriented to present a fundamentally different kind of lawman than the one audiences thought they already knew. The character who had seemed to operate outside the system in the original now needed to become its defender against those who truly and completely rejected it. This conscious narrative correction transformed the sequel into something you rarely see in franchise filmmaking, an image repair project disguised as an action thriller, actively rewriting the story that audiences believed was already settled. The pressure that produced this pivot was real and significant. The backlash surrounding Dirty Harry wasn't just critical noise to be dismissed or weathered. It represented genuine public concern about what Hollywood was telling audiences to believe, to admire, and to want. The voices raising these concerns came from influential corners of society, and filmmakers couldn't pretend they didn't exist without paying a serious price. What the sequel produced under this pressure is a film designed as a counterargument rather than a repeat performance. Instead of doubling down on the elements that cause the outrage, it pivots toward a moral framework that systematically challenges vigilante thinking from within the genre that had been accused of celebrating it. The story doesn't just avoid repeating the mistakes critics attributed to the original. It turns those very accusations into the engine of its plot, creating antagonists who embody the authoritarian fantasy the first film had supposedly promoted, and then spending 2 hours dismantling everything those antagonists represent. The way the film presents its villains deserves particular attention, because the choice made here is genuinely unsettling once you grasp what it's doing. These rogue officers aren't wild-eyed fanatics operating from society's fringes. They don't announce their malevolence through disheveled appearance or erratic behavior. They're disciplined, respectable, polished, the kind of men whose superiors will hold them up as examples of exactly what a police officer should be. They carry themselves with military precision, maintain impeccable professional standards, and project the very image that institutions use to earn public trust. This makes them infinitely more disturbing than any conventional villain could be, because the danger they represent doesn't come from outside the system. It emerges from within its most trusted and admired ranks. These men genuinely believe they're serving justice more effectively than the courts ever could, and their absolute conviction combined with their respectable facade creates antagonists who force audiences to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. What does institutional power actually look like when it becomes corrupted from the inside while maintaining every outward appearance of legitimacy? Behind the scenes, the production was not without its genuine creative conflicts, and one disagreement in particular left visible marks on the finished film. John Milius, who contributed significantly to the screenplay, had specific ideas about how certain violent moments should be handled. His instinct leaned toward restraint and suggestion, toward allowing audiences to imagine horror rather than witnessing it explicitly on screen. Not everyone involved shared that philosophy, and the tension between showing violence and implying became a real point of contention during production. At least one scene that Milius believed should rely on implication was instead filmed with full explicitness, becoming visceral on-screen content that left nothing to the imagination. This was a gratuitous addition for its own sake. It emerged from genuine artistic disagreement about what audiences needed to experience versus what they could construct in their own minds. The final cut reflects that tension throughout, containing sequences that push further than at least one key creative voice thought necessary or appropriate, and knowing this changes how you register those moments when they arrive. Then there's a mythology surrounding the franchise's famous dialogue, and here the reality is considerably more interesting than the legend. Stories have circulated for decades claiming that the most iconic lines were born from spontaneous improvisation, from Eastwood reaching beyond the script in brilliant, unscripted moments that nobody planned. The truth gives credit where it's actually due. Those memorable phrases were carefully crafted on the page by writers who labored over word choices, tested rhythms, and worked to create language that would land with maximum impact. The spontaneity that audiences perceived came entirely from performance. Eastwood's delivery transformed scripted words into something that felt immediate and natural, creating a convincing illusion of off-the-cuff brilliance where none existed. Understanding this doesn't diminish the power of those moments at all. It redirects the credit appropriately and reveals something important about the collaboration that produced them. The myth celebrates the actor while erasing the writers who built those verbal weapons for him to fire. Performance created the legend, but craft created the performance's raw material. The tactical and procedural authenticity that grounds the film's action sequences came from an equally interesting source. The writer's engagement with firearms wasn't research conducted for the project. It was knowledge accumulated over years of genuine personal involvement with gun culture and shooting sports. In the 1970s approach to action filmmaking, this kind of embedded authenticity produced something qualitatively different from what you get when technical advisors are brought in temporarily to supervise production they have no personal stake in: the weapon handling, the tactical movements, the procedural details that experts would immediately notice. All were handled correctly because someone who genuinely understood them was conceiving and writing the scenes from the ground up. This is knowledge woven into foundation rather than applied as a layer during production, and the result carries a weight and believability that elevates the material well beyond the typical genre fare flooding theaters during the same period. Among the film's most carefully constructed elements is the motorcycle officer who serves as its central antagonist, and this character operates on multiple levels simultaneously in ways the surface narrative barely hints at. On the functional level, he's a plot engine, a figure who drives action and creates conflict. But the filmmakers built something far more deliberate into the role. This character is institutional power distilled into human form. The motorcycle, the uniform, the rigid discipline, the absolute certainty that never wavers, all of it communicate authority that demands compliance without question. He embodies a seductive appeal of order imposed without hesitation or doubt, the fantasy of a world kept clean and safe by someone who simply doesn't have the weaknesses that make the rest of us ineffective. Audiences watching him aren't just observing a villain. They're watching an idea made flesh and given purpose, an argument about what happens when discipline becomes fanaticism, and duty transforms into a zealotry that answers to nothing and nobody. He isn't merely someone to be defeated. He is a concept to be recognized and rejected, and the role serves that symbolic function as powerfully as it serves any narrative one. This brings us to one of the most persistent tensions running through the entire production: its identity crisis between spectacle and substance. The film finds itself pulled in genuinely competing directions that it never fully resolves, and the result is a movie caught between two impulses that have different audiences and different purposes. On one side sits the obligation to deliver the thrilling set pieces and visceral excitement that people paid to experience. On the other lies the filmmaker's evident ambition to inject genuine moral and political commentary into a genre that critics had repeatedly dismissed as empty entertainment. These impulses don't always coexist comfortably. Scenes designed purely for adrenaline sit alongside moments constructed to provoke ethical questioning, and the film asks audiences to hold both registers simultaneously without fully satisfying either. Some viewers came for pure action and found themselves confronted with uncomfortable ideas they hadn't signed up for. Others came for the ideas and had to wade through genre mechanics to reach them. This tension isn't necessarily a flaw in execution. It's an honest reflection of a production genuinely trying to be more than its genre typically permitted, while still delivering what audiences expected and deserved. Central to this ambition is the film's distinctive approach to the violence it contains. Action cinema in 1973 generally treated brutality as spectacle, as thrilling content designed to generate excitement and provide cathartic release. Magnum Force takes a deliberately different path. The brutality on screen isn't framed as heroic or exciting. It's presented as harsh, uncomfortable, and genuinely disturbing in ways that resist easy enjoyment. The camera doesn't celebrate what it captures. When characters fall, the film doesn't signal audiences to cheer. Instead, it forces them to sit with discomfort, to register that what they're witnessing represents something ugly and wrong regardless of which side of the law is responsible for it. By refusing to glamorize its action sequences, the movie distances itself from the very genre it inhabits, replacing the cathartic rush of justified violence with an unease that lingers past the moment. This risks alienating audiences who came for escapist thrills, but it reinforces the moral architecture the sequel was specifically designed to establish. Violence isn't fun here, it's a problem, and the film insists you recognize it as such rather than simply enjoying it. The production extends its thematic work into its choice of settings in ways that are easy to miss, but impossible to unsee once you notice them. Institutions that normally represent safety and legitimate authority, courthouses, police facilities, spaces designed to contain danger and uphold order, become crime scenes throughout the narrative. The visual argument is unmistakable. Danger doesn't merely threaten these institutions from outside. It takes root within their walls and operates under their protection, wearing their uniforms and driving their vehicles. When violence erupts in spaces designed to prevent it, the disorientation is profound and deliberate. The film suggests that the system society depends on for stability might harbor the very threats they claim to prevent, might provide cover and legitimacy to exactly the corruption they were built to oppose. The settings aren't backgrounds for action sequences. They're arguments about where real danger originates and how effectively it conceals itself behind facades of respectability and official sanction. Against all of this, the film makes a crucial decision about its protagonist that shapes everything else. Harry Callahan is kept grounded, human, and constrained by realistic limitations throughout the narrative. The temptation to let him grow into the superheroic figures that franchises typically produce across sequels was consciously resisted. A superhuman Harry would have undermined every moral argument the film wanted to make. By keeping him fallible, capable of genuine danger and genuine mistakes, operating within recognizable human boundaries, the production maintains the credibility that an exaggerated version would have sacrificed entirely. He stays someone audiences might actually understand and genuinely question rather than simply worship as a power fantasy made flesh. This restraint in his portrayal represents one of the more quietly sophisticated choices the filmmakers made, preserving the character's humanity at exactly the moment when franchise logic would have pushed toward mythology. The film's ending carries the full weight of everything it has been building toward. The conclusion isn't simply plot resolution. It's a thesis statement delivered as action, a deliberate and unmistakable declaration about where legitimate authority ends and where tyranny begins. Harry's final choices communicate values that directly contradict everything critics had accused the franchise of promoting. Rather than validating extrajudicial action or celebrating violence outside proper legal channels, the ending firmly establishes where the character stands and what he's willing to defend and what he's willing to destroy. Audiences leaving theaters weren't just meant to feel satisfied by narrative closure. They were meant to carry an ideological argument with them, to have absorbed through 2 hours of thriller mechanics a position on justice, restraint, and the necessary limits of power that the filmmakers had spent every scene constructing. What the film's success with this approach inspired, and what then failed to materialize, represents one of its more melancholy footnotes. The template of pitting Harry against corrupt institutional authority rather than conventional street criminals had opened genuinely fresh territory that could have sustained a sophisticated franchise for years. The intention existed to make this the new model for subsequent Dirty Harry films, exploring different forms of systemic corruption and abuse of power across multiple entries. But later sequels drifted away from this ambition and back toward more conventional thriller territory with traditional antagonists and straightforward moral conflicts. The franchise abandoned the template Magnum Force had established, retreating to safer and more familiar ground rather than building on a more challenging and more interesting direction this film had pioneered. Beneath all of this formal and thematic analysis lies something worth sitting with. The film is a document of a specific and turbulent American moment. The nation in 1973 was reeling from revelations about institutional corruption and governmental overreach that had shattered public trust and authority at every level. Audiences carried deep suspicion with them into theaters, a bone-deep wariness about the people and institutions that claimed the right to exercise power over their lives. Magnum Force taps directly into this cultural atmosphere of profound distrust by making its villains precisely the people society had empowered to protect it. This premise resonated because it reflected anxieties that were already circulating widely, already shaping how Americans thought about police, government, and official authority in the long shadow of Watergate and its revelations. The film gave narrative form to fears that had no other outlet, and in doing so it created something that functions as much as a historical document as an entertainment product. The score that composer Lalo Schifrin built for the film deserves recognition as a crucial element of how all this thematic work is communicated to audiences. The music doesn't function as typical action accompaniment designed to amplify excitement. It operates instead as psychological manipulation, building tension and creating persistent unease rather than generating the adrenaline rushes that genre audiences expected. The score reminds viewers at every turn that what they're watching isn't meant to be purely enjoyable. Discomfort is the intended response, And the music ensures that feeling persists even through sequences that might otherwise generate straightforward excitement. Sound becomes emotional control, an invisible hand guiding audience response toward exactly the unease the filmmakers wanted to create and sustain. The film changed Eastwood himself in ways that became visible across the decades following its production. Something about the experience of confronting the criticism of the original and constructing a deliberate response altered his perspective on the kinds of characters he wanted to inhabit and the kinds of stories he believed deserved telling. In the years that followed, he gravitated increasingly toward morally complex figures who defied simple categorization, characters haunted by doubt and burdened by their own histories rather than the clear-cut tough guys of his earlier work. The questions raised during the making of Magnum Force about authority, vigilantism, and moral boundaries stayed with him and shaped his artistic sensibility in lasting ways. Audiences who study his later directorial work carefully can trace threads back to the reckonings that happened during the sequel's creation. Critics who reviewed the film upon release largely missed what it was doing, focused on surface violence and working under deadline pressure. They treated it as another entry in the cycle of brutal cop films that defined a certain strain of 1970s cinema, without examining what distinguished it from those films ideologically and morally. The deeper architecture went unexamined. The careful moral framework constructed to answer the accusations against the franchise went unrecognized. Time eventually provided a perspective that contemporaneous reviewers lacked, and later analysis recognized what the original reception missed. Beneath the action beats lay genuine intellectual engagement with questions about power, authority, and the nature of justice that the film's surface appearance had successfully concealed from those looking only at the surface. What Magnum Force ultimately achieved is rare enough in franchise filmmaking to deserve genuine recognition. It didn't extend its predecessor. It transformed what the franchise meant and what its central character represented at a fundamental level. Harry Callahan emerged from this film as a different kind of figure than the one who entered it. His values clarified, his relationship to legitimate authority fundamentally altered, the accusations that had defined public perception of the character addressed so directly and thoroughly that they could no longer stick with their original force. And the questions it raised in 1973 about unchecked power, institutional corruption, and the seductive appeal of authority without accountability have not faded with time. If anything, they've grown more urgent and more contested. Contemporary debates about police power oversight and the limits of legitimate force echo through the narrative with a clarity that feels less like period commentary and more like ongoing prophecy. The film doesn't belong to its decade. It belongs to every generation that watches it and recognizes in its warnings something that hasn't been resolved yet, and perhaps never fully will be.